Bem, nós vamos proceder como de hábito, recolhendo algumas perguntas da plateia, devolvendo a palavra para o palestrante. Antes eu queria fazer um agradecimento especial e específico à BMF Bovespa, sem cujo apoio esse evento não teria sido possível. Então eu aqui me valho aqui da presença de Carlos Caval, Eduardo Guardi, para que transmitam a direção da BMF os nossos agradecimentos. Enfim. Okay, no, I think I ask people to, if possible, to make the question in English and before that to identify herself or himself. Felipe.
Very interesting talk, no doubt about it. 3 points I just want to make. First, from a Brazilian point of view, we were kind of expecting in the dynamic of the crisis that you'll have a corporate crisis after the financial crisis. And this is something that we had many times here. And how do the corporates manage to finance themselves with the banks and the M2 and the money just kind of reducing so dramatically? The second point is that on the fable of the ant and the grasshopper, the largest grasshopper tends to come out quite well in the crisis. I mean, you've seen that. How do you react? Why? And the third point is, as a journalist and as an analyst, isn't that a dream to be able to not have to look every day for a new subject? This is very, very exciting. How do you feel like that?
It seems more like a nightmare.
If I may stand up, at least the last question is very penetrating, and I have people have asked me this similar question, and I've said that as a journalist, this crisis is as an economic journalist, this is the most exciting opportunity of my lifetime. As a citizen and a father and a grandfather, I find it absolutely terrifying. And in late 2008, early 2009, when the world economy was simply falling off a cliff, and when it was really not obvious what would happen, particularly in late 2008, it really was terrifying. And I think it's very wrong to assume that the recovery we've seen should be taken for granted. Mistakes could have been made in policy, which would have led to an absolutely monstrous crisis. The second question gets perfectly to my version of the grasshopper and ant story, which is the mutual dependence. And in particular, if you are an economy with very weak domestic demand and very dependent on exports, and your customers all go bankrupt, you're in serious trouble. You've lost your market, and by the way, all the money you invested, you're going to lose too. And that is exactly what happened. It is very, very clear that those economies that specialized in exporting and have very weak domestic demand have been very badly damaged. The interesting thing about China, which has clear ant characteristics in my terms, is that when the crisis hit, the Chinese government responded in, to my mind, an unbelievable way. I did not expect this, so I learned something very important in the ability to turn off on the taps of investment spending. This was the biggest single stimulus program that the Chinese really are Keynesians. They did it the Keynesian way in investment. That's what Keynes recommended. And they did it on a massive scale. So they protected themselves in the short run as a result. Now they have the problem of getting out of that in a reasonably stable way after this incredible expansion of credit. I think they probably will, but because they're very smart and they have huge resources and they have utterly independent of the world. But managing that is very hard. In the case of Japan and Germany, with very weak domestic demand, when Japan was the worst hit because it's really driven by net exports and investment that is itself driven by net exports. Germany's statistics are very striking. Over the last 10 years, 2/3 of Germany, this is a big country, 2/3 of German net demand came from abroad. So it is entirely dependent on what happens abroad, which is why the Eurozone crisis is potentially very serious for it. At the moment, China's doing very well. As long as that continues, Germany is fine. But the point about ants and grasshoppers in the human world is we are dependent upon one another. And particularly, ants are dependent on grasshoppers, who will, as I always say, in the end default. So they get them. They will be right. The corporate crisis issue is very, very interesting. I didn't have the time to go, because I have much more complicated presentations, about 70 or 80 slides, on what's happened to the financial sector. And here we've got a very interesting dualism, which, by the way, applies to all the developed world. I haven't looked at your markets because I don't know enough about it. Those corporations that are able to borrow in the bond market are actually now fine. Big corporations which are able to borrow in the market, because the bond markets, the big corporate bond, not the securitized markets, the corporate bond markets, the spreads have collapsed, gone back to very low levels. If you've got an investment-grade corporate, you can borrow. So large corporates with reasonably strong balance sheets are fine. Those companies, mostly small and medium-sized enterprises that are dependent on banks for finance, are in really considerable trouble. And the result is a marked divergence in the performance of the corporate sector. This is one of the reasons, I think, why in the US you have this strange phenomenon that while the GDP decline was relatively small, as I've shown you, the employment decline was so severe because this crisis damaged, of course, the construction sector dramatically, as in Spain. Why has Spain got the highest unemployment in Europe? Because the construction sector has collapsed. And second, it's damaged the small and medium-scale enterprise sector. And these are the businesses that employ people. The very large corporates, the GEs and so forth, don't employ many people directly. So the answer to your question is the big corporates have been able to go to the bond market. Most of them have very strong balance sheets. Obviously, the private equity businesses, finance businesses, less so. And so they've come through this very strongly. The problem, however, is now they're sitting on lots of cash. The big corporates, they're very profitable. They're not investing it. They're running enormous financial surpluses, and these are being invested by them in the government. By the way, that's how the Japanese system has worked for 20 years. Japanese corporates have enormous private sector surpluses, which I've shown you, and the counterpart is the government. So you've got a completely insane, economically insane situation when huge corporations, instead of using money, are investing to the government, which then finances completely wasteful investment and consumption. This is a dysfunctional system, and unfortunately the US is moving in the same direction.
Okay. One more question. Ali.
I had the great pleasure to listen to you yesterday night, and I'm still fascinated today as well as I was yesterday.
Would you please introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Pedro John Meinrad, and I'm a retired former journalist and engineer. And I'm just presenting you a practical problem of somebody who does not own a company or industry. What would you advise to somebody to do with $500,000 or $1 million? Well, would you apply them? That's it.
That's a good question. I think you can answer it.
Brazilian bonds.
Brazilian bonds. Very simple.
Brazilian banks bonds.
My answer to those questions are the answers that all properly trained financial advisors give, which is, what is your risk tolerance? What is your time horizon? And then we can discuss it. If, however, you want me to answer what are the completely safe investments that will yield 10% real, I'm going to pass on that one. It really does depend on what you want to hold. The one thing you can say, at least in the Western world, is that the relative prices of government bonds and safe high yield, what we've always thought of as safe high yielding corporate equities, are very weird. We are actually in a world in which the nominal returns in terms of dividend yields in many countries on relatively safe, what we've always thought of as safe equities, are higher than the yields on government bonds. Unless you believe we are going into deflation, the bonds of the US, German and UK governments look hopeless investments. Just hopeless investments. So I tend to the view that the time has come to take a bit of risk. Because it may not be that risky. Quite apart from that, since I'm a very nervous person and I like to be hedged against all possible disasters, of course I have some gold.
Mr. Wolf, my name is Lício. I'm from Facamp. I'd like to listen to you on the international monetary system. What do you think that is the future of the yuan, the euro, and especially, of course, the dollar? Thank you.
Okay.
Maybe we can add one more question.
That's a many hours question to answer. Okay.
Good to see you again. We had a chat last year in Istanbul, right?
Yes, right.
I am Genésio de Carvalho. One of my activities to teach at the Getúlio Vargas Foundation International Finance. My question is very sharp. You have an international eye. How you saw the growth of the Brazilian transnational company, and most specifically, the big issue of the Petrobras equity transaction last month?
I think
all politics are local.
I think my instinct is I'm not competent to. I mean, it would be ludicrous for me to comment on the equity financing of Petrobras. It gets into so many areas. So, I mean, it's fundamental questions. What is the optimal way to develop valuable local resources, national resources? You would expect from me, because I'm an economic liberal, I don't really believe in national oil companies anyway. So I think the governments can get revenue out of natural resources much more efficiently by taxing foreigners. But to me, the fundamental question is, what is the optimal way to develop these resources? That's the fundamental question. And to me, that's more interesting, and I would answer that in terms of that question. But I couldn't go really beyond that. It would be quite unreasonable for me. I talk about so many issues where I feel I know a little. To start talking about things where I really don't know anything would be inordinately stupid. So I'm going to move to the international monetary system, which is a really interesting question. I'll make, I think, 3 points. The first is the international monetary non-system, as my dear teacher Max Corden, I don't know whether it's a name that means anything to you, but Max was though now pretty elderly, very distinguished Australian international trade and monetary economist, and in a number of books on the international monetary system, wonderful books written in the 70s and 80s, he used to call what we have now the international monetary non-system, because we have no organized structure that determines the relationships between exchange rates, no organized structure to govern in any way the monetary policies of major states, and the principal system is floating among major countries, and intervention of a completely higgledy-piggledy and unpredictable way by others on, as I said, a scale we've never seen before. This is essentially a chaotic monetary system, and the reason we have a chaotic monetary system is that we obviously live in a world of monetary nationalism. The single most important point about the world, from a monetary point of view, is we live in a world of monetary nationalism. And the fundamental point I would make, and it's a part of the theme of my most recent book, published in Brazil, called Fixing Global Finance, is this works sort of, but it's very, very chaotic. It's inherently very chaotic. And one of the byproducts of this system, I argue, is periodic massive financial crises. It's sort of inherent in such a system that you will see periodically inherent monetary crises. I don't have the time to go into why in detail, I think, but that's the first point. It's an inherently unstable system, number one. Two, we are not going to change it. There is absolutely no chance of creating a different sort of monetary order. We are not going back to Bretton Woods. contrary to Bob Mundell and many of my other friends, we are not going to go back to the gold standard. And we're going to, if we're going to have a global economy at all, we're going to have this sort of system. So that leads us to the third question, which is how do we manage such a non-system which is periodically going to explode into crisis? My view has been there are two essential problems we have to fix. The first problem is the system itself has to have enough insurance within it for countries that get into difficulty that people don't have to feel they self-insure on this scale. And therefore, my own view remains that a body like the IMF, I don't care if you close down the IMF and create a new one, that doesn't matter to me, which provides general insurance for people who don't issue reserve currencies, not only should exist, but it must be much bigger than if we're going to manage our system than it has been hitherto. I played some part in the arguing for the big increase in IMF resources, but IMF resources are at the most $1 trillion, total reserves are $9 trillion. It's obvious the IMF is too small. Probably we need it to be 3 or 4 times bigger, this insurance system. That's a part of what we need to do to manage the crises that will happen. And the second thing we've got to get away from, but how we do this is more difficult, is the Triffin problem, the Robert Triffin problem associated with the dominant role of the dollar. Because the dollar being the reserve currency, everybody wants to hold the dollar. That leads the US to current account deficits. And in my view, as those deficits have increased in size, the stress it has placed on the American financial system has finally become unmanageable. The Americans don't see it that way, but that's because they have no understanding of their own situation, because they still think of themselves as a large country, largely unaffected by what others decide. And that's no longer where they are. But that is an unstable system. Very dangerous. The question, however, is whether it becomes less unstable by moving to 3 currencies. The euro is doubtful, for the reasons I've outlined. It has expanded as a reserve currency. It now has about 25% of world reserves. I suspect that's about the peak, at least for a long time, because people are very worried about the euro. The renminbi is potentially a world currency, but in my view, not for another 20 years. And the principal reason for that, absolutely core issue, very related to this crisis, is that the Chinese know that if they want to make the renminbi a world currency, they must make it fully convertible. You cannot have a world currency that is not fully convertible. If you have a fully convertible currency, you lose control over your domestic banking system. And for the Chinese government, the domestic banking system, as this crisis has shown, is the principal instrument of control over the economy. It's what they use as a lever. And for this reason, they're not going to go this way. So for the foreseeable future, we're in the non-system with an inadequate IMF and a reliance on the US, which can no longer support the functions of the reserve currency as easily as it did in the past. The only conclusion you can reach from these propositions is we're going to have more big trouble. But the only certainty we'll have more big trouble. And the logical conclusion of this, of course, is that you should all accumulate even more reserves. And the logical conclusion of that is the US deficit problem will get even worse, and the next crisis will be an even bigger mess. Probably a US sovereign debt crisis at some stage way out into the story. This is a very big mess, and we have no means of solving it.
Eduardo Pires from Alupar. If you think like that, how can you still defend, and I read your columns regularly, still more stimulation in the economies?
The answer to that is I'm an economist who believes in the second best. Actually, I believe in the third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, and eighth best. You do the best with what you have. The reality of the world in which we now live is that we have, I would like to change this, very deep structural surpluses in the world in the 2 areas I've discussed, in a lot of countries and in the non-financial corporate sector. These are not going to change. We have monetary policy which is as aggressive as you can possibly imagine to get households to borrow and corporates to borrow, and it ain't doing much. Right? This is not, in my view, because of lack of confidence. It's because because the corporates have nowhere to invest. That's a long story, and there's nothing that will create a huge investment boom in the developed world. It's just not possible, and the household sectors are leveraged to the hilt, so they're not going to go into borrowing. So there are only two ways we can sustain a reasonable level. Remember, our economies are operating, on average, in the developed world about 10% below potential now. Between 6 and 10% below potential. So on any plausible view, I think, maybe 5, but very far below potential. There are two ways out of this in terms of just avoiding a slump. I'm not wanting much. We've got a very weak recovery. There are two ways out of this. One is to have an enormous expansion in domestic spending, and I mean enormous in the emerging world relative to potential output, which makes the emerging world the engine for the whole world. That's not going to happen. The emerging world isn't big enough. You can't pull. Even China isn't big enough. China's GDP is something like 8 or 9% of world GDP. The developed world still, in market prices, which is relevant to this, are 50 or 60, depending on which you define. So they're not going to pull it. So that leaves you with the government. It's the least bad outcome. Unless you can get a massive recovery in the private sector, you end up with fiscal deficits. My own view, by the way, is you could cut the fiscal deficits ex ante and they would re-emerge ex post. It's just impossible possible to avoid this. What we really need, of course, as I said, is either some combination of an enormous expansion in fixed investment and an expansion in demand in the emerging world to save the developed world, but I don't think it's going to happen. I think this is an incredibly undesirable situation. Now, I have some clever tricks which would go a long way towards solving these problems, but they're unfortunately not going to happen. I'm going to propose one proposal I have is that should be 100% corporate profit tax combined with 100% expensing of investment. So basically, we strip out all the retained earnings of corporations above what they invest. There's absolutely no social interest in having corporations accumulate cash. It's a useless function. It just allows corporate management to waste money. So that would get rid of, I'm sure this has already lost me 3/4 of my audience. That would start doing something about this ridiculous surplus in the corporate sector. And then we are going to have to probably be even more aggressive on monetary policy as an alternative to fiscal policy, and that's going to happen. But the basic problem we have here, in my view, is we have a fundamentally unbalanced economy in terms of demand relative to potential output. This is, of course, very controversial in economics. I happen to believe that every 60 or 70 years or so, the economy ends up in a Keynesian situation. This happens to be that period. Obviously, I do not think, this is a big issue in the US, that these fiscal deficits are crowding out the private sector. I see no evidence for this whatsoever, none. There's a lot of rhetoric about it, but there's absolutely no serious evidence for it, in my view. So, as I said, I believe in the nth best, and this is the nth best policy.
What do you think is the impact of this non-monetary system on the trade system? Do you think the deepening of these problems will affect the trade system, the WTO, in a very devastating manner?
I think you could argue that for a very long time they were complementary. They worked together quite well. In the simple sense, if you think back to the fixed rate regimes, the truly fixed rate regimes, when you became uncompetitive, you think of probably Brazil's experience, but many emerging countries had this experience. You became uncompetitive because inflation was too high. The fixed exchange rate made you more and more uncompetitive at that price. You needed a devaluation. It was inevitably going to happen. And then you couldn't have it in the fixed rate regime, so countries started introducing protectionist measures. So protection was, without a doubt, a substitute for exchange rate flexibility. And as countries have moved towards greater exchange rate flexibility, it's actually, I think, allowed more, it's allowed lowering of trade barriers. And certainly one of the striking features of the last 30 years at the world level last 40 years, actually 30 years at the world level, is that we moved to the monetary non-system and trade barriers have fallen. Most of the world trade barriers have fallen. In fact, we've had an absolutely enormous trade liberalization, particularly in the emerging world, in the last 30 years. So we could say that they have been proved highly complementary. And one of the reasons I, following my teacher, as I said, have been a strong supporter of the non-system is exactly this. It allows the adjustment mechanism to be the exchange rate rather than making the adjustment mechanism trade policy. This doesn't necessarily work, I think, in an environment like the present for the reason that I argued. If a country, which I think is the case with China, is using exchange rate policy as a substitute for protection, it's implicit protection of both exports, export subsidy, a deliberate currency intervention on this scale is, in my view, a substitute for an export subsidy come import tariff, then other countries are encouraged to retaliate. And that is what we are, I think, beginning to see the danger of, and that is why having countries in the non-system, some of which pursue such aggressive intervention, and obviously China is the most important case by far, does, I think, destabilize this non-monetary system, and the result is quite likely to be protection. That's what I was talking about. So in general, I would say that the monetary non-system was very bad for financial stability, but pretty good for liberal trade. More recently, I'm not convinced it's even very good for liberal trade because of the fact that China isn't playing by the same non-rules. China is making up its own rules, which is fine when China was a little country, but China as it is now is too big to be played by its own rules in the non-rule system. I don't know how this is going to end up. That will be my answer to your question.
Three more questions. Can we go ahead, then we close? Right. Norman.
We've talked about this over the last few days, but I'd like to ask this question publicly. Brazil is running increasing public current account deficits as well as government deficits. It's pumping up consumption with a huge credit boom. It seems to be somewhat of a carbon copy of the crisis that you describe in the United States. I think that the Brazil is on the cusp of what in the United States was called a subprime crisis. I was wondering whether you might comment on this.
I think my best answer is, having spoken to you and having had the opportunity to speak to many Brazilians in the last few days, I have decided that in the next few weeks I will write a column about Brazil and I will address this question. That's the first point. The second point is that as an economist who has looked at many countries in crisis, few of the features of the current Brazilian situation, including what I just showed on the growth story, would disturb me a little. I tend to the view that the long-term trend growth of the Brazilian economy is somewhere in the 4-5% range, and because given the savings and investment rate, therefore, once it starts growing faster than that, there is likely to be considerable stress. This is an environment in which any country that looks plausible can borrow almost whatever it wants, and the capital inflows are going to be incredibly generous. The world's private sector wants to invest in big emerging countries, so the supply of funds are going to be irresistibly attractive. It's going to be available, and that sort of party often ends in tears. However, I have not analysed the data carefully enough, and my guess would be, from what I do know, that if you are right, the crisis may be surprisingly far away. And of course, one of the consequences of my story is when crises are surprisingly far away, they have a tendency to end up surprisingly big. The two work together very, very well. So I tend to think, a friend of mine in London says, the most important thing is to have small crises regularly. Small. The problem is we don't have them often enough. I'm not suggesting this in But Brazil, of course, as President Cardoso knows, has not had any significant crisis of any kind since 1999, I suppose, with the exchange rate crisis. So this is 11 years, which is a good long time. Even we have banking crises even in the West, relatively small, every 10 years. So that also would worry me. But I'm not going to pronounce until I've really looked carefully at the numbers. But you have certainly given me cause to think.
Good evening. My name is Pedro Moreira Salles, and I guess I'm a local representative of the locust class. So, and the question, so that may affect my credibility.
Many of my best friends are locusts.
Okay. But the question is the following. This highly unbalanced society that you're talking about and this almost end or collapse of the Western world, don't you think that this system has created an incredible amount of wealth in the last 50 or 60 years, an amount unprecedented from the point of view of the development of societies? And aren't we maybe throwing, as we say in Brazil, throwing out the bathwater with the child in it? Because cycles do happen, and you just mentioned that this could be yet another cycle, and we tend to get out of cycles without having really such a immense disruption, which is what your point has been along the presentation.
I think that's a very, very important question. Sorry. That's a very important question. Are we throwing out the bathwater with the baby? The answer to that is almost certainly yes. I mean, as you say, there are pendulum in economies and also pendulum in government responses to economies. Before, in good times, we regulate too little, and after a crisis, we regulate too much. So there is clearly going to be overreaction, and then over a time, we will unwind it all and have another crisis, for sure. The question you really, but there's so that I agree with. There are two deeper questions here. First, you're clearly right that we have seen in the world as a whole, actually, over the last 60 years, unprecedented growth and prosperity, and clearly broadly defined, the market system is the cause of that. So I'm a supporter of the market system. I wrote a book called Why Globalization Works, and I remain a believer in this. However, the role, the financial sector plays a role in this. It's not as important as people in the financial sector think it is. There are many other aspects of the competitive process that are more important, and some aspects of what the financial sector did in this context are, I think, very difficult to justify in these terms. Yes, but let's not think that the very last invention of the financial sector was necessarily necessary in that regard. And for the same reason, I think that the surprising feature of the regulation that is now happening is that it is actually, to my surprise, overwhelmingly concentrated in the financial sector, and most of what is happening does not seem to me, that's a big issue, does not seem to me likely to suppress the more valuable functions of the financial sector in a very deep way. There's no overwhelming argument to suggest that if the financial sector is required to hold more capital than it did before, that this will destroy its activities. There are many activities of the financial sector which are very valuable in private equity and venture capital and so forth, which don't depend on this sort of leverage at all. If the derivatives market shrink a little, I don't think that any devastating consequences will follow. So I'm not persuaded, but I'm open to persuasion. One has to be a reasonable person. I'm open to persuasion, but I'm not persuaded that the regulation we now see is going to kill these golden geese. Ultimately, the geese that lay the golden eggs. Ultimately, that depends on competition, trade, real investment, and so forth. And if you look at the world from that point of view, from the story I've said, what's going on in the world at the moment is, from the point of growth, unbelievably exciting. One of the most extraordinary statistics I read just I think it was in my paper today, that they think, though what the meaning of this will be, I don't know, that next year China will have more patents than any other country in the world. I'm sure many of these are pretty frivolous and trivial, but nonetheless, we are in, the introduction of the Chinese and Indian peoples into the modern economic system is a simply staggering increase in the application of brain power, energy, human motivation. It's going to continue to transform the world. So I do not think that what we are doing in our regulatory system will end the capitalist system. Far from it. It's going to look very, very Chinese and Indian 30 years from now and not as Western. And that may not be such a bad thing. Was there one more before I collapse under all this?
Well, my name is Sergio Moraes Pinto, and I work at the São Paulo municipality government. Mr. Wolf, it's a pleasure to attend your lecture, and I would like to know, in your idea, what would be the role of the state in the economy in the middle and the long term?
You should have come to my lecture yesterday, which was entirely on the role of the state. It was very difficult subject to answer. I think my broad answer to this question is very simple and very complicated. One, very important. The role of the government is very important. States are very important institutions. And I became aware of this, if I may put it this way, when I started my career, I worked on East Africa. I worked on Africa. And therefore I worked in countries which didn't have functioning states. And it didn't take you very long to realize this was not a very good place to be. So functioning governments are very, very important. Unfortunately, functioning governments can also be excessively, as it were, from the previous question, excessively intrusive and worse than intrusive. So the trick in politics, government, is I argued in this piece that essentially what we want to create is very strong, effective governments which provide essential public goods, infrastructure, everything else, and at the same time are constrained, are limited, are bound, we don't want to live with Leviathan, in the words of Thomas Hobbes. And this is a very tricky thing to do. I discussed in that lecture the role of democracy, which I'm generally in favour of, as you would expect. But I think it is also clear, and that's the last point I will make on this, that the rise of China in its present guise, and I'm not predicting where it ends up, will reawaken a whole range of questions about democracy, about technocracy, autocracy as systems of government. There are very large numbers of people in the emerging world, not I think here, who find this Chinese model rather attractive. So that's a third really big aspect of the world. After the fall of the Soviet Union, we all thought, or many of us thought or hoped, we were living in a world with a decisive and permanent shift towards democracy, which was clearly a very important theme of politics in this country and this region in the last 20, 30 years. But for the world as a whole, this is no longer so obvious. And the rise of China changes this. We are moving into a world, as I tried to indicate, of state capitalism, and very, very pronounced state capitalism. And that creates real problems in terms of living with this, because these systems don't work the way our systems do. So that's the third and final point. Sharing, the last issue I discussed this fits into this, in that lecture was about global governance. And one of the things we have to do, global governance is built on states. States are the bedrock of global governance. But when states, major states, big, powerful states, are so profoundly different as, say, the US and China are, making the world system work is ineluctably going to be far more difficult than it was when it was just a Western club. So governments are very important. Huge questions arise about limiting it. Huge questions arise about how best to control it. And huge questions arise about the relationship between states and particularly great powers today. So I think the question you've asked is a central one for our future, and about it I have far more questions than I have answers. If that was was that the last question? Let me say, first of all, I'm very, very grateful to you for listening and immensely appreciative of the politeness of listening to somebody talk for 2 hours on a subject like this in what is, after all, not your native language. So I appreciate that very much. I apologize for not having learnt Portuguese. I didn't know how important Brazil would be, and Portugal, I'm afraid, wasn't big enough to justify learning Portuguese. So my children and grandchildren will know better. I want to thank my host here, Norman Gall, who looked after me so well, and particularly for the honour of appearing in your institute, President Cardoso, because you're one of my heroes, and because you're one of the very few policy makers in the world, and there really are a handful of them whom I know, who've actually made incredible differences to the future lives of hundreds of millions of people. One of my other great heroes and a friend of mine for 40 years is Manmohan Singh, Prime Minister of India, who in a very different way had a similar role in India. But there are very few, there are a small handful of policy makers in the world. Deng Xiaoping, obviously, in China, for all the crimes he committed, Manmohan in India, a few other cases, and you here, who have really changed the world. So I immensely appreciate the honour of being asked to give this lecture in your institute, because it was for you. Thank you very much.
Let me say to you that we are grateful to you, because most of those are here who are trying to understand your views and trying to debate about your views, and the way you present your views now so vividly, so in a so fascinating manner, really was fantastic. And I was looking after you, I said, my God, what the energy. I have no more possibility to do the same, to stand up and speak and again, very clearly, and with sense of humor. And at the end, making a joke with me, no, too much. I'm not a hero, I just try to do something with friends. Some of them are here around this room. And, I'm very happy because, in fact, what you said about Brazil is true. We are moving ahead. Now, after your speech here, we have to reconsider and to discuss not just our economic horizon, but also our political horizon. Because even here, the Chinese model has some people trying to sustain the possibility. I don't know. I am like you are too. I'm very open to new ideas. Maybe in the future I'll become a very fanatic, applauding this state capitalism. Up to now, I'm still keeping my reserves. But anyhow, thank you very much. It was fascinating.